Good evening, everyone, and welcome. I'm Suzanne Kenawi, AUC Press Marketing Manager. And on behalf of AUC Press, I'm delighted to welcome you to tonight's virtual book discussion, celebrating the release of Edward Said, The Politics of an Oppositional Intellectual, by Nubar Hovsepian, published by AUC Press this June. Edward Said was one of the most influential intellectuals of the 20th century. A literary scholar with a aesthete temperament, he did not experience his political awakening until the 1967 Arab-Israeli War, which transformed his thinking and led him to forge ties with political groups and like-minded scholars. And in this intimate intellectual biography by a close friend and confidant, Nubar Hovsepian offers fascinating insight into the evolution of Said's political thought and interventions, which he argues have succeeded in changing the parameters of discourse in the humanities and among younger Jews searching for political affiliation. We're thrilled to be joined by the author himself, Dr. Nubar Hovsepian, Associate Professor Emeritus of Political Science at Chapman University in Orange, California. He's the author of Palestinian State Formation, Education, and the Construction of National Identity, and he edited and contributed to the edited volume, The War in Lebanon. He's the author of books on Palestine, Lebanon, and editor of several books, including ones on the Iranian Revolution. He has devoted enormous time to the Israel-Palestine conflict and served from 1982 to 1984 as political affairs officer for the United Nations Conference on the Question of Palestine. He will be in conversation with David Barsamian, an award-winning international broadcast journalist. He altered independent FM dial with his weekly radio program, Alternative Radio, 39 years and running. Barsamian is the author of numerous books, and among his books, ones with Edward Said, Pen and the Sword, and Culture and Resistance, and books with Noam Chomsky, Chronicles of Dissent, and Notes on Resistance, among many. David lectures on world affairs, imperialism, capitalism, propaganda, the media, and the global rebellions. Tonight's conversation promises to offer timely, thought-provoking insights into Edward Said's enduring relevance as a critic of power, a voice for justice, and a tireless oppositional intellectual. And now, please join me in welcoming Nubar Hovsepian and David Barsamian. Over to you, David.
Thank you. Welcome to the program, Nubar.
My pleasure, David. Good to see you, my friend.
Congratulations on your book, Edward Said, The Politics of an Oppositional Intellectual. You write in the preface that your book is guided by a simple inquiry. How does Edward Said's humanism inform his politics?
That's precisely the formula I followed, right? I did not want to write something that others are more capable of producing. You know, there are others who dealt with his literary criticism, with his music and all that. But I was interested in explaining Said as a political person, right? He was not your average person who goes down on the street and demonstrates. He was involved in politics, and I wanted to see, is that a connection between his Orientalism, culture and imperialism, etc., his literary articles in Raritan, etc., and his politics. And I felt that the humanism, which he describes in his book, Democratic Humanism, is what guides his understanding of not only Palestine, but what to do about Palestine.
You say Edward always insisted on the virtues of democratic humanism. What is that exactly?
Well, for Edward, number one, he very much hated being pigeonholed. He didn't, he was criticized by people for not being a Marxist or not being a good Marxist or a bad Marxist, etc. Or he didn't fit any mold. His mold was a democratic humanism that insists on the ability to see the other and to recognize that this form of humanism, it brings together a shared space to be able to create a better future. Right? So his democratic humanism has a theoretical, obviously, philosophical underpinnings, but also a practical one, right? Because his democratic humanism insists on the politics of inclusion and not exclusion.
Inclusion without domination. That's a key theme there.
Precisely, yeah. And that's precisely the critique he marshals of in his book on the question of Palestine, in his second chapter, precisely on, Zionism from the standpoint of its victims. Okay? That's precise. He says, you exclude me. The point is to be included, all of us, right? We don't want to eliminate anybody, but we insist on being included, because otherwise there is no solution.
You say that his literary career and politics feed into each other. Talk about that.
Well, look, when you look at his early work, right? I mean, his early work was, on the world, dealing with beginnings, right? That's the title of his book. It's a brilliant book, but it doesn't show his politics as in a more pronounced fashion. But it's there. He's affected by Palestine from day one. It is muted in the early days, becomes more pronounced because he's living in America with the 67 war, all right? So in that sense, his humanism, his understanding that guides his work through Orientalism, culturalism, the world, the text, and the critic, these are just some of the titles, help him understand that what is needed here is to look at the people, the rights of people, right? He's looking at people, the oppressed, those who are subjugated to colonial domination, and who need to be freed, right? All of this, his humanism incorporates many things, including ideas coming from Fanon and from Cabral, and then his most immediate mentor being, I think, Iqbal Ahmad.
The role of an oppositional intellectual, or the responsibility of intellectuals, to use the Chomsky term. Here he's influenced by Gramsci. They should not be intellectuals, experts in legitimation, and resist the lures of power. They should speak the truth, expose lies, hypocrisy, and deceptions. It's quite a menu there of the responsibility of intellectuals.
It is. Now, look, Edwards' view of the intellectual is kind of two levels. One, he articulates that view in his essays that were literally written for a radio broadcast, for the lectures in London, right? His essays on the intellectuals. They're useful, but I find something else. The notion of oppositional intellectual is something that both he and Chomsky share. That is, the oppositional intellectual is guided by, and actually it is required to address people, not power, to enable people to resist power, to arm people with ideas and understandings, to be able to engage in creative forms of resistance. To me, that's the oppositional intellectual. Now, remember, David, in my book, I juxtapose that with the embedded intellectual, or the servants of power, and those who sit on the fence, right? Now, those who serve power, they could come in all shapes, colors, and forms. The ones I identify who serve power very well: Bernard Lewis, Sam Huntington, and of course, Fuad Ajami and Kanaan Makiya. and former lefties like Christopher Hitchens, who joins the fray and becomes a neocon towards the end of his life. That's one form of intellectual who serves the interests of power. Another, Walzer, which I find the most problematic, at least the others are clear where they stand. Walzer theorizes that Camus, sitting on the fence in Algeria, is his model. Now, years later, Camus' Arabs, who are not part of his story in The Stranger, right, are written about by an Algerian writer who reimagines that and brings the Arab voice to the ground. So in other words, the muting the other is, in my ways, a conscious and deliberate act of obfuscation, right? Which the Walzers of the world engage in. So together, these intellectuals serve power or kind of justify it or rationalize it. The oppositional intellectual is one who resists the lures of power, who insists that speaking the truth is addressed to people so that they can oppose those in power. That, in a nutshell, is, I think, Edward's view and practice. And on that, he and Chomsky literally are in agreement.
These members of the guild, as it were, become cheerleaders for war and empire. And in particular, native informants are given much prominence. You mentioned Fouad Ajami. There's also Kanan Makia.
Yeah. See, I mean, let's take Kanan Makia. I know both Fouad Ajami and Kanan Makia, knew them, right? Fouad Ajami was a graduate student at the University of Washington when I was an undergraduate in '68, right? He was fairly standard pro-Arab, pro-Palestinian, etc. In a few years, he emerges as Fouad Ajami, that is loved by the American media, by Kissinger and others, because he's the Arab who tells them the truth about Arabs, which is to debunk Arabs. Okay. Now, Kanan Makia, on the eve of the first Gulf War, I actually invited him to speak in my class at Hunter College. And at the end of it, I asked him, do you have any fears, regrets, concerns that your people are going to be bombed tomorrow? He said no. See, I find that just absolutely incredible. Now, of course, he's a nobody today. He just had his name in the limelight for a little while. He served the neocon interest for a while, and then he was dropped because he was not useful, right? He didn't produce anything intellectually interesting, etc. Neither did Fouad Ajami. Fouad Ajami wrote beautifully, but he was always the interpretive essayist and not a scholar of research. So these are the native intellectuals are useful to carry out the interests of the occupying powers, the interests of imperialist powers, and with a native face. And that's what Edward discusses in Culture and Imperialism. But I think more importantly, he sees these characters as people who need to be resisted because of what they obfuscate, what they eliminate, which is voice of the oppressed.
Where else does Edward get his intellectual nourishment? You mentioned Chomsky, of course, Gramsci, Iqbal Ahmed, Ibrahim Abul-Lughod. They were the last two, Iqbal and Ibrahim, were very close to Edward, and he dedicates Culture and Imperialism to Iqbal and Orientalism to Ibrahim and Janet Abul-Lughod.
Yeah. Look, I mean, Edward obviously has many influences. Some I just mentioned, but we really won't go through them. He, of course, deals with Foucault, and in his work, he says, well, ultimately he differs with Foucault over the issue of the notion of resistance, right? Foucault sees systems as overbearing, whereas Said looks for ways to resist dominating systems. He didn't have much use for some of the postmodernists, and he disassociated himself from the postmodernists who viewed him as their star, right? So let's keep that aside. I make an argument that Edwards' view of the intellectual is one that is based on activism. And precisely because of that, I say his book on intellectuals is a useful essay meant to be broadcast on the BBC. But if you really want to understand his view of the responsibility of the intellectuals, you see his association with Noam Chomsky as central. And when you look at the correspondence between them, it is a massive correspondence between them. They agree, disagree, but they just hold each other in high esteem. And I surmise that the way to see his view of the intellectual is to look at his fallen brothers. Iqbal Ahmad, 2 years later, Ibrahim Abu Lughod, and then 2 years later, Edwards joined them, right? So in 6 years span, we lose 3 important figures. Now, Iqbal was a key figure. Edward was introduced to him through Ibrahim. Iqbal was a student of third world politics, of liberation movements, right? He was big in the US, right? During the anti-war movement. He was part of the Chicago, of the Harrisburg 7 case. You know, the government brought a suit against them, charging them with conspiracy to kidnap Kissinger, right? And of course, they won the case because they had great lawyers and great support nationally. Iqbal introduced Edward to ideas about liberation movements. In many ways, he tutored him to some things. Of course, Edward knows a lot. It's not that he doesn't. But Iqbal kind of kept insisting about certain things. You know, the first and foremost, Iqbal resisted the idea that of worshipping of guns. He just found that to be absolutely short-sighted and irresponsible. Right? Somebody like Cabral, really the theoretician of the African revolution against Portuguese domination from Guinea-Bissau, he said, look, we will use violence, but ultimately we have to learn how to divide the forces of the enemy to win them over in order to win. In other words, Iqbal insisted on the need for militant struggle. And militant struggle does not necessarily mean armed struggle. It does not exclude it, but it can't be reduced to armed struggle. So Iqbal preferred nonviolent means. Edward saw that as valuable, all right? And he then invited Iqbal to join him a couple of times to address his interesting ideas to the leaderships, both in Beirut and then later in Tunis. Iqbal's words fell on deaf ears with the leadership. But he left us with an important legacy, and that book produced by Columbia University Press of his writings are a gem that needs to be looked at. So Iqbal was crucial in his understanding. Ibrahim, on the other hand, is crucial in situating Edward's understanding in the immediate Palestinian context, not just history, but in the immediate context of the national movement and all that. Edward was a privileged person. He lived in New York and in Columbia. You know, the Palestinians needed somebody like him to identify with them. In fact, when the first time Shafi al-Hout, who was the PLO representative in Lebanon and a major figure in Palestinian history. He told me, look, first he hadn't heard of Edward, so he was curious to know who he is. Then second, he said, well, we needed his solidarity. I find that interesting. As a Palestinian, he wants Edward the Palestinian to be in solidarity with Palestinians. An interesting notion, because his presence would legitimize, would provide some ways of explaining the rights of Palestinians, the justice of the Palestinian cause, right? So these two figures are crucial, Iqbal Ahmad and Ibrahim Abu-Lawad, in informing Edward's understanding of political in the quotidian sense.
Edward also celebrates intellectuals outside the normal sphere. In Representations of the Intellectual, that book, he celebrates James Baldwin and Malcolm X, whose centenary we just marked,
Yes.
incidentally, African-American stalwarts.
See, I mean, Edward celebrates Baldwin, and for good reason. I mean, I remember as a young immigrant, when I came with my family after having left Cairo, and I went to Lebanon, and then we arrived in Seattle. And when I went to the university 3 years later, the first person that I was introduced to who taught me about the African-American experience was James Baldwin, right? I mean, his writings just resonated with me. And of course, Malcolm X is a fascinating figure and a historic figure. And Edward was amazed by both. Then in a more contemporary sense, I mean, Edward was supportive of Reverend Jackson's presidential candidacy, which was an important event in modern American history, Jesse Jackson. So he understood that experience and those two figures, plus others, obviously, right, as central to understanding America. That's crucial. Understanding America means you understand them beyond the headlines that cover up those stories.
And Edward emphasized the need to understand your adversary, in this case, the Israelis.
See, indeed, right? To understand the adversary does not mean that you have to have a power with them. What you need to do is first understand what they're doing, why they're doing it, right? That is, your adversary has to be understood in order to know how to confront them, how to weaken their resolve. This is what Iqbal insisted on, that a social movement, a liberation movement, its first task is to weaken the resolve of the adversary, right? Now, unfortunately, in Palestinian modern history, too many things have happened that strengthen the resolve of their adversary rather than weaken it. But that's a question of understanding how do you advance your cause, right? Do you advance your cause just by declaring I did something, or do you do it by doing something effective? Right? So in that sense, I think Edward was right on the mark, but that's the theme we see in all liberation movements. Cabral was the best. I mean, his understanding of Portuguese society was incredibly detailed, right? I mean, Edward did look at Cabral. Unfortunately, he doesn't give him as much space as Fanon, and Fanon deserves the space. I just think Cabral deserved more space in Edward's culture and imperialism. But he knew that Fanon and Cabral were of two historic figures that explain the need to dissect the interests of the adversary.
as well as Fanon's Martinican brother, Aimé Césaire.
Of course. I mean, see, Edward always refers to Aimé Césaire, Cahiers au retour du pays natal, etc. Right? And Césaire, he always invoked that notion that there is room for all at the rendezvous of victory, a notion that, a statement that Césaire makes, and Edward invokes it on so many different occasions to the point when you read his work, you forget what is the original source of the reference from Césaire. Césaire, Edward not only looked there, but he also looked at other important figures, C.L.R. James, also from that Caribbean, right? And he did a long interview with C.L.R. James, right? And they talked a lot about C.L.R. James's love of cricket. Right? I mean, he loved to write about sports as well. This great figure who wrote the Black Jacobins, right? And so, that interview that I think was published in Interview magazine is a classic interview, as well as the interview he did on other subjects in that magazine.
Let's circle back to Yasser Arafat. One of the things that Iqbal advised him, and I believe Edward was present during this discussion, was to urge that Palestinians peacefully march to Israel's borders with signs saying, "We want to go home." That suggestion, among others, was ignored by Arafat, an opportunity lost.
See, unfortunately, this is an interesting point. I share it, but at the same time, let's remember that your adversary for now rejects any form of political gesture because they want to stamp you out, right? So when Palestinians later on decided to have a march to the border in Gaza with Israel, it didn't last long, but it was an interesting gesture. It was useful. The point here is that Edward believed that one of the best ways, and this is something that Iqbal actually raised. Iqbal actually raised that idea in 1968, months after the 67 war. He addressed the Organization of Arab Students in the United States, and he proposed that idea from that time. So it's an early on idea. And what he did was to say that ultimately our struggle is a political struggle, right? That it must involve understanding the adversary and looking at what are the means and methods that weaken their resolve rather than strengthen their resolve. So in some ways, there are some, I know, in Palestine during the beginnings of the second Intifada, some people called it Intifadat al-Jidar, the Intifada that brought us the wall, right? And the question becomes, what was its purpose? It expresses the anger of the conquered over the conqueror. It expresses the resistance of the occupied to the occupier. But the question that still remains, and that Edward would ask, what is it? How is it advancing one's objective, right? So that's the criteria. He said, how do you measure it? You measure it by looking at what is it that advances the struggle versus that retards it as such.
Edward never joined the PLO, the Palestine Liberation Organization, but he was for a time a member of the Palestine National Council, PNC. He and Abu Lawad and others muted their criticism of Arafat and the PLO. Why?
Look, I mean, Edward was not a organizational man. I mean, I remember someone who tried to get Edward to join one of the organizations of the PLO, and he told me Edward is unorganizable. Right? He's a good friend of his, right, and a good friend of mine too, and he might recognize who he is, right? But why did Edward affiliate himself with the PLO, right? I mean, remember the conjuncture is 1974. 74, you have the Arab League states that the PLO is the I don't know how to mute this. The PLO is the representative of the Palestinian, the only representative of the Palestinian people, the only legitimate representative. Then later, the UN invites the PLO and Arafat to address the General Assembly of the sole legitimate representative, as my friend Cristiano just posted. 74, the UN recognizes the PLO as and gives it observer status. So for that trip, it is people like Mahmoud Darwish, the poet laureate of Palestine, and Shafi al-Hout, one of the most important political figures of the Palestinian movement. Okay? And he was dear friends with Ibrahim Abu Lugd and Edward. They want to meet Edward because they don't know him well. And second, they think he could help them in rendering Arafat's speech to English in a proper, with proper translation and diction. That is how Edward is pulled into the process. And he obviously then forms relationships that last for a lifetime. You know, Mahmoud Darwish writes a poem about him later, about Edward Said is in the heart of Palestine, right? So I think, so Edward's role here is to identify publicly, that is, Edward has a couple of notions, if I may backtrack: filiation and affiliation. He affiliates, that is, he makes a choice. Filiation is a tribal connection, right? You're an Armenian, I'm an Armenian, so we're part of the Armenian tribe, right? Or we can be the non-Armenian Armenians, the non-Jewish Jews, right? As you and I seem to find. Edward was of similar notion. He hated nationalism, but he supported nationalism. He's the non-national national, right? In that sense. So he chooses to affiliate as a way of expressing and supporting Palestinian cause in the fields in which he excels, which is the university, the media, and the public, right? And that becomes an important figure because they needed him to affiliate. And he chose to affiliate at a risk. He was vilified. And of course, the number of people who vilified him and organizations are too long to list, you know, because Palestine was seen as, you just don't affiliate with Palestine and Palestinians. Okay.
So you mentioned Mahmoud Darwish, the national poet of Palestine. In Edward's book, After the Last Sky, he quotes the couplet by Darwish: "Where should we go after the last frontiers? Where should the birds fly after the last sky?"
Yeah, it's, you know, interesting you bring that up, right? This is probably the least reviewed book by Edward. Right?
After the Last Sky.
Yeah, After the Last Sky, and the person who makes such a strong claim that it is not reviewed sufficiently is a former student of his who I think he's still at UCLA, I'm not sure, Amir Mufti, right? And he writes a wonderful essay on this subject. Edward's After the Last Sky is a meditation. It's a meditation that it's a book with two essays. One, photographs, right? Jean Moore, right? I remember first attending the dinner with Jean Moore and Edward and Shafi al-Hout in Geneva, sitting on the lake of Geneva, beautiful restaurant, in which Shafi al-Hout brings up the idea, why don't you guys team up together to do a book? And I suggested, well, maybe it's like After the Seventh Man that Jean Moore and John Berger produced on migrant workers in Germany, right? They proceed to do that. These two essays complement each other, but Edward's words are, how should I put it, pensive. He's forlorn. He's not giving in, but it's a sad book, I think, because the reality is sad, but it's also a way of depicting a people who still insist on clinging to their land, to their nationality, their existence, their home, in their homeland. So in that sense, it's a wonderful book. I wish it was reviewed more. I think it was incredible.
You quote him saying in After the Last Sky, continuity for them, the Israelis, the dominant population, discontinuity for us, the dispossessed and dispersed. That's a direct quote.
Yeah, discontinuity is precisely the Palestinian story. The ruptures, continuous expulsions, continuous forms of violence marshaled by the Israeli forces with total silence of the world.
That brings us to Gaza today.
Precisely that, right? I mean, so we have the English Prime Minister saying this is not good. Well, get off your butt and do something about it, right? So these are all perpetrators of genocide. Their silence is deafening, right? And irrespective of which administration, the Palestine question and the war on the Palestinians. It's not a war on Gaza. It's a war on the Palestinians in Gaza as a location. But there's also a simultaneous war taking place in the West Bank. At least 50,000 Palestinians have already been displaced in the West Bank during the war on Gaza, right? And more settlements. Area C, which is under Israeli control based on the Oslo configurations, is being settled to the point where the settlements have just become incredibly widespread. And they have eliminated the possibility of seeking a two-state solution, which the international community still clings to, but they don't tell you what part of Palestine is available for the second state. None of it is available right now because the Israelis, especially with this criminal government of Netanyahu and all those ministers, right? Unfortunately, you have a bunch of fascists running the state of Israel, and American media does not call them out for their fascism, right? So I think what is taking place in Gaza today is the extreme expression of what Edward mentions in the quote you just brought about, exclusions. It's literally now a genocidal war of ethnic cleansing, right? And we see that every day.
And that genocidal war is aided and abetted by the United States of America.
By United States, America, and companies like
Boeing,
Microsoft, right? So a lot of the technology they use for their drones and all that, I mean, these are technologies produced by American corporations, right? So you have one company whose CEO, whose founder is against this and gets arrested. in Ben and Jerry stuff, but the rest have no moral compunctions.
The sheer scale and level of destruction of what's going on in Gaza, and also I should mention the annexation of East Jerusalem, and as you mentioned, more and more land being confiscated in the West Bank, which has clearly been targeted for further colonization. The sheer scale of the death and destruction has created, I think, some openings, at least for some critical views to get through. Not much, but at least it's not that 100% monolith that has so characterized U.S. attitudes and European attitudes towards Arabs, Islam, and the Palestinians.
See, I think we have a major divide between officialdom and what's happening in American society or European society, right? I mean, you see massive demonstrations throughout the world, whether it's in London or Rome. Now, unfortunately, none of the massive demonstrations have happened in the Arab world, right? And we probably know why. I mean, too many authoritarian regimes preventing their people from expressing their views. In America, I think one of the interesting things is that a lot of people who used to consider themselves pro-Israel and Zionists have come around. They have become critical. I mean, one figure in particular whom I find very endearing and very admirable is Peter Beinart. Peter Beinart's book on Zionism over a decade ago starts the first line with, "I'm a Zionist." Right? Peter Beinart's latest book on Jewish condition and the Gaza war is clear. He sees the futility of a two-state solution. Now, if a two-state solution works, nobody will oppose it. But show me how it will work. It's not working because the Israelis are gobbling up the land. So the younger generation, and we see that in universities across the country, are improving the American discourse, right? In academia, in certain working class areas, right? Does it affect policy? Zero. Right? But that is not, go back to the anti-war movement. The anti-war movement against Vietnam did not affect policy until later. It took a long time for then the Congress to decide, wait a minute, we have to do something. Right? So we're not there yet when it comes to Palestine. In fact, we are still in the moment where American policy bluntly supports genocide with no excuses, with no moral compunctions.
You quote Omar Bartov, an Israeli historian, professor of Holocaust and Genocide Studies at Brown University, talking about, quote, "The Holocaust has given license to Israel to oppress others in the name of its victimhood." And Edward always talked ruefully about the fact that the Palestinians were the victims of the victims.
See, I think that's an important observation. I remember when I visited Yad Vashem, some of my Palestinian compatriots were critical of my decision. I had a good friend of mine who was part of the Women in Black at the time demonstrating in Jerusalem, accompanied me there. And one of the interesting things about the Yad Vashem, the Holocaust Memorial, right, is you go through it, and then at the end, the resolution is Israel is founded. So out of the ashes comes Israel. It's a simple story, no conflicts, no occupation, no war, etc. Right? It's just a simple claim. Now, The problem, I think, Israeli society has difficulty accepting, with the exception of a few writers, who probably are not listened to in Israel anyway these days, who see that the Holocaust enables the silencing of critical thinking about Palestine and Palestinians. It essentially, among radical right-wing Jews, the Holocaust means that they have the right to do anything to anybody as to protect themselves. Yeah, that was the JDL in New York. Now that JDL has a presence in the Israeli Knesset, not formally, but through Gvir and others, right? So I think the Bartov's article, and I'm very happy I've read it, and I think it's very important. And many others, my colleague at Chapman, Shira Klein, has written a wonderful study on issues pertaining to the Holocaust and discussions around that. So it is an important question. And my point would be, and here I invoke my Armenian background, that is, we must conclude with a universal lesson, not a particular lesson. The universal is that our humanity is at stake, all of us, right? It's not just the people who are perpetrated against. We have to learn that the lesson of the Holocaust has to have universal answers, right? And unfortunately, it does not. And I think the key person who rejected universal lessons, somebody who I address and critique heavily, is Elie Wiesel. Elie Wiesel essentially never found anything about Israeli policies to be critical of, because of his role in the construction of the narrative about the Holocaust and its impact on the Jewish soul, right? And mainstream people like Rabbi Arthur Hertzberg, who was a colleague of Edwards for a while at Columbia University, wrote a major critique of how can he do that? That's not our moral tradition. That's not our Jewish tradition. Now, of course, people like Sarah Roy took him more directly, saying, you don't see Palestinians. You don't see, so he described Jerusalem as their city. He says, but you don't see Palestinians who live there? He is morally blind, right? So I think the only way we can think about genocide, Holocaust, etc., is by extracting a universal lesson. If it only is a particular lesson, humanity has no future.
You spoke of Palestinian ruptures, multiple ruptures. 13 September 1993, the Oslo Accords, celebrated with great fanfare here in the United States. Edward Said was furious. He called it a Palestinian Versailles. Arafat had given away much and got almost nothing in return. Although invited to the White House ceremony, Edward refused to attend. His critique was trenchant and spot on. The Israelis took the Palestinians cleaners. Negative repercussions of Oslo for Palestinians continue to this day. There you see a complete breach with Arafat and the clique around him and Edward.
See, in many ways, Edward had the soft spot for the leadership, which is normal, right? National liberation movements have a singular objective, which is to achieve the rights of their people for self-determination. Critiques of leaders are postponed, right? Edward, before Oslo, launched a critique of the leadership, and Oslo will open the door wide open, right? Now, what was his problem with Oslo, right? I mean, what's interesting, first, let's look at two individuals wrote about Oslo, Edward Said and this wonderful Israeli historian whose latest book is absolutely brilliant, Avi Shlaim. Right? Avi Shlaim praised it in the pages of I believe, the London Review, in which he said, this gives us a chance for the future. A few years later, Avi writes saying, Edward was right and I was wrong. Right? What was Edward's problem with Oslo? The Palestinian leadership had essentially given up on mass mobilization and resistance as a price for pursuing Oslo. Right? In other words, the history of the Intifada that precedes it is simply muted, relegated to the sidelines to pursue a diplomatic objective. The reality of struggle is that the mass mobilization has to be in conjunction with your diplomatic solution. What were the problems that he had and others? Anybody, look, if there was any small chance that Oslo worked, nobody would have been against it. I wrote something about it as well, and I said, I hope I'm wrong, but I don't think so. Well, history has proven us not to be wrong. What is it? Israel never admitted to be an occupying power. Now, that's an incredible omission. If they're not an occupying power, then they can easily claim that this land is theirs, that Palestinians are intruders. Well, isn't that what Netanyahu and his cohorts are doing today? They're doing it in Gaza. They're doing it in destroying several refugee camps in the West Bank. Right? So the Oslo critique was important. Now, there's one Arab ambassador to the United Nations who begged Arafat not to relocate to Palestine as a result of Oslo. And that was Clovis Maqsood. Clovis Maqsood, Lebanese, who's an ambassador of the Arab League to the UN and then to Washington. And he begged Arafat, said, do not go. Stay outside to represent the unity of your people. If you go, you'll become the mayor of Gaza, at best. He was also right on that. To Edward's misfortune, he was right. Because that misfortune means that people continued to suffer, to have their lands taken, their water supplies taken, being imprisoned. In other words, being denied their human existence, their national existence. I think the story of Oslo is clear. And we have so many people. I noticed that Ian Lustig joined this conversation. Ian's book about the lost paradigm. It's an incredibly good book that deals with these questions in a very thoughtful manner, and I appreciate his work so much.
In the course of your research on the book, what did you discover that surprised you?
My first answer to that is not much. But then what surprised me probably more as I delved into some of the archives was what were the reasons behind Edward's inability to have the question of Palestine, the book, appear in an Arabic edition. All right. Now, what's fascinating, I discovered a document in the archives in which a letter is sent to him by Constantine Zre, who is the head of the IPS board, with an an appended memo of about 30 items that they wanted changed. The person who wrote that, I believe, was Walid Khalidi, right? Walid is a great reader. He identifies some errors. There are technical errors that any good editor would catch. But their basic problem with the book was that Edward, on many occasions, including in the book, sees that Jews have rights and have claims in Palestine, and then he provides the codicil, provided that they do not dispossess Palestinians. Now, early on, he sees inclusion, the two living together, as central to an understanding of the past, the present, and the future, right? There are so many changes that they requested of him. And finally, the letter from Zireh says, it might be best for you and us that that we not publish it in Arabic, right? And the book, it's published in Hebrew, it's published in Portuguese, Spanish, German, you name it, it's published, but not in Arabic. It's a surprise and it's a scandal, right?
Edward loved music. He was an accomplished pianist and for many years the music critic for The Nation magazine. His friendship with Daniel Barenboim led to the West Eastern Divan Orchestra with Palestinian and Israeli musicians. Talk about that collaboration.
See, Edward met Barenboim at the Brown Hotel in London. Edward was checking in or checking out, and Barenboim was there. So they both approached each other, and he came to introduce himself. So Barenboim says, "I know you," and Barenboim introduces himself, "Oh, of course I know you," right? And from there starts a long friendship. It was not a friendship based on political agreements, right? Barenboim evolves over time, right? He doesn't articulate all the things that a Palestinian wants to hear. But Barenboim has some interesting idea. For example, he writes about Oslo, why it failed, and he writes it in music. It's as if the tempo, the tone, etc. In other words, he produces a musical explanation of its failure, right? Which I thought was rather elegant, right? Now, the relationship was one that also produced an orchestra, the East-West Divan, right? And it brought together musicians from all parts of the world. And there's a wonderful film about one of the performances they had, which was in Ramallah. So, and that it's kind of narrated to some extent by multiple people, including Mustafa Barghouti, right? And it shows the depth of the program. And I use that film a lot in my teaching to say that, look, for a moment, imagine that you and the other share the same space, right? In moments of optimism, that sounds good. In moments when Israel is literally bombing the hell out of you, these are empty words, empty promises. I think the orchestra was something that was dear to Edward. He loved music. He was a good performer, a very good performer on piano. I attended his concert at Columbia University, right? But more importantly, he wanted to discover Palestinian talent. And he would get Palestinian philanthropists to support these young Palestinian to become, to develop their art and to become performers on a world scale. So till now, this association is important. At Edward's funeral, only one person brought the music. And as Barenboim played one piece at the end, with tears coming down his eyes. In other words, they had a love relationship. They loved each other, but they also had differences, right? But the human touch is so important, right? So I cherish that history, and I hope that history reinforms the future search for common destinies, common futures.
A couple of quick questions. We're running out of time in this segment. Is Said's work read and studied today in the Arab world? Do young Arabs know about him?
I think, of course, a lot of Arabs know a lot about him. I think the biggest disservice to Edward was the way the translation of Orientalism happened, right? Now, Edward chose the translator. And I speak now from direct information because I was part of the publishing group that published Orientalism in Arabic, right? And I think some of the critics pointed out that the translator saw himself as an equal partner in the production of the book, which is an ego larger than that. I'm not going to mention his name, but I think the turgid translation killed that book in Arabic. So anybody who read the book in Arabic probably did not fully comprehend the complete oeuvre that Edward had produced in Orientalism. And it's not a book that was easy to begin with, in English. Aside from that, his works have manifested themselves in a variety of ways. Edward began to chose to address Arabic audiences through his syndicated columns in Al-Ahram Weekly and in what was it called? A Saudi-funded newspaper. I don't remember now. I'm sorry. Which, of course, he stopped writing for as a result of the First Gulf War, right? So those articles were important. A lot of his books have subsequently been translated, but they were translated well. Fawaz Trabulsi has done an incredible job in translating Edward's memoir.
Out of place.
And Out of Place, right? And other books. So, and I think the reception in the Arab world is interesting, right? And I write about that on my chapter on Orientalism, that, and this is where a lot of peculiar things happen. Some view Orientalism from the standpoint of kind of culturalist, Islamic understanding of the world, right? Some critiqued it for being producing an equivalence between Orientalism and Occidentalism. And that was the critique by Sadiq al-Azam, a very good friend of Edward's, who later became, and they separated their friendship over a number of issues. So till now, Edward's best known writings are his journalistic or essays. I don't think with a few exceptions. I mean, if you go, say, in Egypt, there were a couple of publications that dealt with Orientalism, that dealt with cultural imperialism, that dealt with the world, the text, and the critic, and all that. But by and large, those are limited in scope and circulation, right? His political writings are widespread and well read, and he was someone to consider, to the point where, at least in my work, I consider Edward to have been, and I refer to several sources, to be both a an exile and an Arab writer. In other words, an exile is part of the Arab world. And I think that, in other words, geography doesn't eliminate your affiliation, but it informs your perspective on the relationship between these two, right? So there's a healthy then discussion about Edward's work, and some of it has been good, but his Orientalism was not as discussed as well as I thought it should be.
His seminal book, Culture and Imperialism, is, you write, heavily influenced by famed Canadian pianist Glenn Gould. That might surprise some people. What's going on there? Explain.
Well, I mean, Edward keeps thinking about point, counterpoint, right? That's to some extent, this is Gould's method of playing, understanding of music. And Edward is looking at point, counterpoint, right, throughout. And the music informs him about the particularity of a place. It informs him about the style that's important to look at and the performance, right? So yes, Gould, he obviously liked Gould a lot, and he wrote a lot about Gould in his music columns for The Nation. Much of his writing on music is something I read, but it's not something that I comprehend very easily because, unlike Edward, I'm musically illiterate.
Mariam Said, Edward's wife, informs us that there's a new Arabic translation of Orientalism. So finally, before we go to some chats, what is Edward Said's legacy?
You know what? In one of my trips to Palestine, with Edward being there, he met with a group of Islamists at Birzeit University. And those students told him, look, Dr. Said, we differ with you a lot, but we respect you because you speak the truth. This is something that needs to be valued. Cabral writes, tell no lies, claim no easy victories. That gives Edward a certain moral standing of, despite his achievements, he doesn't hide behind his achievements. He speaks truth bluntly, to the point, and to serve the interests of his people. In that sense, I think that is his greatest forte.
Thank you for your time, Nubar.
My pleasure, David.
Let's go now to some questions from the viewing, listening audience around the world.
We received a question asking for someone who wants to get acquainted with Edward Said, if there's a best book to start with, if you have any recommendations.
I think first you should read Edward Said.
Yeah.
You know, modestly, I think my book is a useful one. I like the Tim Brennan book. It deals a lot more with his literary work and all that, which I kind of avoid because it's not my forte. And it's not something that I wanted to write about. I want to write about his politics, right? So I would say read his books, read his articles, and go ahead and purchase my book anyway.
Okay. There are some questions about the relationship of Edward Said to Armenian intellectuals, Armenian history and the genocide, of course. And how was the relationship of Edward Said to that, with all its parallels to the Palestinian question? But also that there's recently a new translation, Armenian translation of Orientalism that was released this year. And could you speak to the significance of this translation and the possible implications of Armenian scholarship thought and political activity?
On the question of Armenian scholarship on the subject matter, I must admit that I'm not a good source on that. Now, David might be a better source than me. Edward's relationship with the Armenian question is very simple, right? He supported Armenian rights, right? He grew up with Armenians, right? And I think, if anything, our relationship between him and me, in part, is because I'm Armenian. He found it rather novel that an Armenian born in Cairo affiliates with Palestine so readily and with no reservations. And second, he loved the fact that he and I could speak the Egyptian dialect together. He really liked the Egyptian dialect more than the Palestinian one, right? Much to the consternation of his wife, who sometimes would hear us and would wonder, why are we speaking this Egyptian dialect, right? But that aside, I think the Armenian question he supported, but then the Armenians were very critical of him over an article he wrote about a case that was in the courts in France against Bernard Lewis. So Edward clearly said, of course, he's done a lot of horrible, nasty things, but a court case is not what is needed. He needs to be tried in the public discourse, right? So he opposed the court case. In other words, he defended Bernard Lewis's right, which of course Bernard Lewis never acknowledged, because Bernard Lewis just is a hateful person, right? So, but the Armenian question also reminded Edward of the potential for perpetual dispossession. Right? Armenians are a people that are kind of exiles all over the world. Only if a fraction of Armenians live in Armenia proper, right? I grew up in Cairo, Armenians in Beirut, in Syria, in Iraq, in Iran, right? Etc. So, and as I grew up as an Armenian, my story is what informed me about Palestine. Being Armenian, dispossessed, made me look at Palestine and say, I'm in solidarity with that question, with that people, with that movement.
A very interesting question came, and I'd like to also know what you, Nubar, and David would think, both of you. So what do you think Saeed would be doing now if he was still at Columbia under attack for anti-Semitism, and how would he be involved in the current situation in Gaza and the future of Palestine?
Edward is turning in his grave to see his institution serve as the representative of Trump's crimes against student movements, against dissent, against critiques of Israeli genocide of Palestinians, right? So I think Edward and others and their brave faculty members, Bruce Robbins, and others who have stood there supporting the students and what have you. So Edward would be with them. He would be joining Rashid Khalidi, who addressed the demonstrators, right? Saluting them for their courage and their public rejection of genocide, right? There is no mystery, right? He would be joining that. He would be part, in fact, he would probably be leading it.
The Columbia administration caved into Trump's demands to curtail demonstrations and punish students. And by the way, Mahmoud Khalil is a Columbia grad.
That's right. That's right. Yeah. Yeah. And Edward stood with, I remember a very important case that happened that is a precedent for all these things. The LA 8 case, when the government back in the 80s decided to prosecute 8 Palestinians under the McCarran Act of promoting communism, right? Their case lasted in the courts for some 20 years. The only reason they won is because they had an international, the most prominent civil rights lawyers, from Lenny Weinglass to Mark Vanderhout, one of the top lawyers in immigration law and all that, who stood with them. And we had an incredible support for that. And he affiliated with this. He understood it. I was involved with these students, and he always wanted to know and to stay in the know. In other words, Edward had an activist streak in him within the limits of his presence, right? And I would say that Mahmoud Khalil has many precedents among students. I salute him, and I hope he rejoins his family and his wife and his newborn.
And if I could just add that Edward always challenged the hegemonic discourse on not just on Israel-Palestine, but on issues across the board. He opposed essentialism, dogma, and any kind of orthodox thinking.
It's kind of funny. I remember in parts of the work, one person who just passed away maybe a year or so ago, Ijaz Ahmad, criticized Edward for not being a good Marxist, for being a bad Marxist. Hello, yeah. And Edward resisted being pigeonholed. Now, he admired and used some of the important figures who produced cultural work, from Lukács to Gramsci and others, right? But he refused to be pinned down. He did not believe in ideology as orthodoxy, right? He wanted to always think of a possible alternative in thinking, in the creativity of the human spirit and the human mind. He is not like the American scholars who don't know anything about the left and Marx. His readings are, in fact, are full of an understanding of that, and he shares their view on many things, Raymond Williams and others. So Edward did not like to be imprisoned. He thinks that people like Foucault imprisoned themselves within their framework. He did not want to be imprisoned intellectually and morally.
There's so many questions. I don't know which to begin with, but one that caught my attention that was just sent from Mona Nail. What if Edward Said had lived in the East, in Palestine or an Arab country, instead of spending most of his life in an exile and in the West? How would you think that would have affected his intellectual project, his views on identity, Orientalism, and the role of the intellectual? Was exile a necessary condition for the emergence of his critical global voice?
You know, look, it's not a question that can be answered, right? Right. I mean, what would have happened if my family decided not to immigrate from Cairo to go to Lebanon and then from Lebanon to the US? Would I be the same person? I don't know. I absolutely don't know. Right? What I do know is that wherever we are, we develop the ability to think critically, to affiliate with justice, and to articulate a people's desire for freedom. I think Edward would have done that, whether he lived in Cairo, Jerusalem, Beirut, or New York.
David, you want to comment? I see you're nodding. You want to add to that, David?
No, amen.
Okay, another question. How did Edward Said understand the relationship between the intellectual and power? Did he believe that an intellectual could remain truly independent from institutions without losing influence?
I'm not sure how to answer that. Number one, nobody is independent of any institution, right? I mean, Edward was an employee of Columbia University, right? But did that employment preclude him from producing his critical oeuvre? No. No. He also was fortunate that the provost during his time was a very good man, progressive, defended Edward to the hilt, right? Because Edward was attacked. I mean, you don't, if you read my book, look at the last chapter in which I detail the types of attacks against him, which are puerile and vindictive, right? So the institution, Edward's presence in the institution, he wasn't beholden to it, right? He thought that the intellectual must resist temptations of power, must resist orthodoxy, must resist the dominant ideas of the day to come up with liberatory ideas, right? So let me leave it at that. I think that's sufficient, because I don't want to speculate too much, because speculation is not exactly a fine art.
Okay, Garen is asking, could Dr. Hovsepian perhaps give examples of any influences on Said which we might not expect?
See, in my book, I claim that the two most important influences in informing his view of the oppositional intellectual are not to be found in his book on intellectuals. They're to be found in the two obituaries he writes about his two departed friends. First, Iqbal Ahmad, and then Ibrahim Abulod. Both of these obituaries were published both in the in Al-Ahram Weekly, but also in the London Review for I think one of them. So that's where one needs to look. That is, I went beyond the detail. The book was either celebrated or dismissed. I mean, clearly somebody like Walter dismissed it, you know, but Edward Said and Walter just did not like each other, right? And I think Walter is morally bankrupt anyway on all of these things. So Edward understood the intellectual from the standpoint of engagement, oppositional thinking, rather than an intellectual in the Ivy League in which he was employed. Let's leave it at that.
A question from Cynthia. She's asking, where will there be a chance for Palestine to continue to exist after the policy of annihilation and demolition now being followed by Israel on its road to conquest? Can there be a parallel to Vietnam protests in this situation? And Vietnam protests were not suppressed as the pro-Palestinian protests are being now.
Nubar, before you answer that, talk about Sumud and its importance to this particular issue.
Yeah. Look, I mean, Palestinians have exercised sumud, which is steadfastness, right? And despite the adversity, they cling to their not only land, but their identity and their demand for self-determination, right? Now, I don't want to speculate on the future. I mean, Edward's view was that there is no solution without being interconnected, right? Jews and Palestinians are interconnected, intertwined. There is no solution in separation. So he was against separation, whether it was in Ireland or in Pakistan. Except separation is not a good formula. In fact, it's a perfect colonial formula that didn't work well in South Asia and in Ireland, right? So, and in that sense, all what I can say about this is, as long as Palestinians and the people in solidarity with them remain steadfast. The future can be bright. It looks bleak right now because we just see too many people dying, too many people killed, not dying. They were being killed by Israeli ferocity and genocidal war, But despite that, there's still that spirit. We want to live in peace and in freedom, right? That's all I can say about that. I don't want to speculate more than that. For my generation, it's a dark time because my time is less than, say, a younger generation left. So I hope in your time as a young generation, there is more hope than I see today.
I'm into that. I think that's the best way to end this virtual talk. I mean, we want peace. We want people to live normally like anyone deserves to. I just want to say a few final words and thank everyone who joined us today. I'm personally honored to have hosted this talk about a larger than life human and intellectual, Edward Said. And again, I want to remind everyone that the book, Edward Said, The Politics of an Oppositional Intellectual by Nubar Hovsepian, who's here, is available for ordering worldwide through major bookstores and online book retailers. And don't forget, you can get 20% discount for a limited period of time if you use the links that I've shared in the chat box. Dr. Hovsepian and David Barsamian, thank you so much for your insightful discussion.
Well, thank you